Okay, so we're talking about organic production today. Whoa. And I have a lot of people to help me. Brogan Tooley is my research assistant, who is a full-time technician. So she's going to talk about fertility research that we're doing. And Becky Gumbrewicz is my master's student who's working on a mulching project, so she'll cover that. And then we have 3 farmers who are going to help as well. Cary, Nash, Nicolas, Lindholm, and Lauren Bruns. So thank you all for your willingness to help, and thanks everybody for joining. Hopefully this one will be more of a discussion. There is a lot of material for us to give you, but feel free to chime in and ask a question anytime, and we'll try to keep an eye on the chat box as well. So to start out, I just wanted to give you a few general observations about organic fields and some thoughts about picking fields to transition. So the general observations are that there are many more weeds in organic fields in general. There are certain growers who manage their weeds extremely well, and they're actually cleaner than a conventional field. So if you're on top of your weed management, you can have an immaculate field. You're probably going to spend more labor on your weeds doing organic production. In general, the fields are lower in fertility, or they look like shorter plants and they look a little stressed. That's a generalization. Not everybody's field is like that. I think this is because these fields are not irrigated, and hardly any of these organic growers are applying a fertilizer because of the expense, but also because when you apply any fertilizer, you're feeding the weeds. And we'll talk a little bit about some cheap, it's a chicken manure that might be a possibility as a fertility for you to use in the future. But there are, I'm concerned that the organic fields don't have enough fuel behind them. And in general, there's lower yield coming off of organic fields. And some fields have a very difficult transition from past conventional management to organic. And that can be for different reasons. In general, in ecology, we know that a field that's been managed conventionally is quote unquote dependent on those inputs and less resilient as a whole ecosystem than an organic or low input field. So the transition can be difficult for certain crops. We haven't specifically studied the transition zone from conventional to organic in wild blueberry. That would be something for us to look into. But when you're thinking about transitioning in a field, you want to make sure you get the history of the regular maintenance. So what products were applied and when were they applied? You'll need those for certification. If you are looking to be certified organic, you need at least a 3-year history of no non-national organic program approved products applied to the field. So that's something to think about. But you also want to know the history of the field for your own maintenance, especially yield. You want to know the yield of the past few cycles. And I would say you want a field that's at least producing 1,500 pounds per acre. I think some people have found that 1,000 pounds will work with their budget. It depends where you're selling the berries and how many berries you need to make a profit. So you also want to look for a field that has very little to no mummyberry. So mummyberry is a real challenge for everyone, but especially organically, you don't have as many tools to manage this disease, and it can really wipe out a good chunk of the field. And So burning is the technique we've talked about to reduce mummyberry, and it does work. The concern with burning is that you don't want to do it too much. So if you can find a field that doesn't have as much in its history, that would be wonderful. I know that these things can be hard to find, but if you come upon a field, there are plenty of fields for sale. And so you can kind of pick and choose, I would rather buy this one instead of this other one. I have included 2 slides here that show the complexity of the wild blueberry system. So Frank Drummond created, he wrote a paper really explaining all the factors that impact yield of wild blueberry. And this is one that you could spend hours looking at, but here he states that pollination explains 25 to 60% of yield variation. So pollination is very important for you as any grower, but I think especially as an organic grower where you already have low nutrient availability, you already have low yield, you may find that pollination can really boost your crop. And this is an organic specific schematic with all the factors that impact yield from a system study that was done by Dave Yarbrough and Shauna Annis and Frank Drummond and Jax Magula. So, this is something you can look at later. There are a lot of impacts on yield, and the dotted lines are negative relationships, whereas the solid lines are positive relationships. So where you see grasses and broadleaf weeds, those have a negative impact on yield. Spiders have a negative impact on strawberry rootworm and grasshoppers. Therefore, these would have, if you reduce those, then that's a positive for your yield. Okay, now I figured we would just jump right into burning, since I know folks probably have a lot of questions about this. We have talked about it in this series before, but that's why I wanted to bring in Cary and Nicolas. We know that you need to burn the top layer of leaves in order to kill mummyberry. But in general, you want to burn the top layer of leaves. You don't want to just do a light burn that just singes the tops of the plants. And ideally, you've already mowed the field before you burn. So the crop is already low to the ground, and you're doing a burn to get the last bit of it and to get to the duff for your pest management. So the paper Lambert in 1990 did find that burning kills 50 to 60% of mummyberries and can decrease blight in the following year. It also kills insects that overwinter in the duff layer. So flea beetle and spinworm are insect pests that you will see because you are organic growers. They are spring insect pests that I'll talk about at the end of this presentation, but they are not being killed by other insecticides, which happens in conventional fields. So you likely will see them, whereas a conventional grower may not. Burning, my warning about burning is always that it can reduce your organic pad, which is the source for a lot of nutrients for your plants, and water holding capacity. And it can burn off your entire organic matter layer if you're burning too hard. So now, if Cary would like to say anything about burning, that would be great. I know Cary's on here. I'll give him a minute to unmute. So maybe the question is, Cary, how do you burn? Do you use propane or oil? And how many acres do you burn every year? I'm looking to see if he's still on here. Maybe we'll start with Nicolas.
Sure. Hi, Lily.
Hi, Nicolas.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, I'll just quickly say what we do. We burn with straw only, and we buy straw now by the truckload from Canada. In a pinch, we'll go and just get our truck full at Ellsworth Feed and Seed, but the price is much more reasonable if you can get a truckload. We have a straw spreader that the Maine Blueberry Equipment Company made long ago. We bought it used through Uncle Henry's. It's really awesome. So we typically try and spread the straw in the fall. We have yet to be able to find a window to burn in the fall, and that would be nice. But we then typically burn in the spring, usually as soon as we can. And that varies from, I think March 20th was the earliest we've ever burned, and like May 8th or 9th was the latest we've ever burned, and it's all weather dependent. And we typically have a hand crew of 4 or 5 of us. That's a photo of my wife and 2 other folks who helped us just this past spring right there. I spread about 40 to 50 bales an acre. Some of it depends on how flat the field is and how big the bales are. There's so many variables, how much the wind is blowing. And then you got to go back sometimes and hand spread to fill in gaps, that sort of thing. But I really rely on it, particularly to control mummyberry and flea beetles, which have only become a problem for me in the past 5 years because I'm mowing fields now. We still have 2 or 3 fields like the one you see in the pictures that are very rocky and are unmowable, so burning is still the only option there anyway. But in fields where I can mow and have started mowing for 3 or 4 cycles now on fields that we lease, we're starting to have explosions of mummyberry and flea beetle in particular. So I see burning as essential, as at least part of maybe 1 every 3 cycles. I'll stop there for now.
That's great. Cary, are you on, able to talk?
Lily, Cary's on. If he pushes his space bar down and holds it down, then he can just talk. He may or may not have a speaker though on his computer.
Yeah, thanks. He's had no problem talking in the past. So Cary, just feel free to chime in if you can, whenever you can. So that's great, Nicolas. Do you get a fire permit every year, or what is your relationship with the local fire department?
Oh yeah, every burn you need to get a permit for, and you get it for the town. So we lease fields in 5 different towns. So at this point, I served on our local fire department for 10 years. So I have a pretty good relationship with the fire departments in our area, as well as the person giving out the fire permits. And if they get to know you, they know you're a commercial in the farming scale, wild blueberry grower, they will often give it to you for a week, though others may just give it for you for a particular day. It's become challenging with especially either windy weather and or dry weather where it's a red flag. So the window of opportunity from when I started 22 years ago has gotten smaller and smaller. We typically now only burn 1 to 2 feet, anywhere from 8 to 15 acres. That's about as much of a time window that we find is available anymore in that, March, April window time. And the big issue for us is also humidity level. You got to choose a day, not only where the day before was dry, so the straw on the ground dries out, but then the day that you're burning, the humidity is low enough so the straw continues to stay dry.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Hi, Cary.
Okay, sorry, I had to dial back in again. Yeah, I could hear most of what Nicolas said, but yeah, we burn with straw and we burn with oil. Like Nicolas, we get straw out of Canada, a truckload at a time. It runs $450 to $475 a bale to get it to the field and unloaded. I'm actually putting on 80 to 90 bales to the acre, probably about double what Nicolas is. We are trimming off the weeds and bushes in the field. We're just fully burning one field with straw now. We do everything else with number 2 heating oil and a burner. And I didn't hear some of what Nicolas said, but it's to burn with straw. It's running us around $600 an acre the last few years, or the last few crops. So it's quite expensive for the straw, and then to get it spread. Then you have to go back with the crew, and I think Nicolas is talking about keeping the fire under control. We may be a little more reckless than some of them. We try to, if there is snow and the rest of the field is dry, maybe snow around some of the perimeter, we'll try to burn up against a snowbank on the edge of the field. Works pretty well to stop the fire. But we have a couple of tractors with water tanks on them hooked up to a pump off the power takeoff, garden hose, and you can just drive right around the field to help control the fire. We don't carry back pumps anymore. I can't find a crew like Nicolas that wants to carry a back pump and get in with the heat and the smoke. So we control the fire doing that. Of course, and maybe you talked about neighbors and burning permits and all. Some neighbors don't care to have the smoke blowing towards them. They do what I can, but sometimes they do end up with smoke in their house. Some towns will give me a burning permit for a couple of weeks or even a month at a time. I just have to let them know where I'm at. Some towns I have to jump through hoops to get a permit. Some of them won't let us burn, like Nicolas is talking about. When it's optimum times, we have to go and start a fire at 6 o'clock at night and spend the whole night out in the field burning because they're scared that we'll have a problem. But we haven't had much of a problem for years. A couple of years ago, I had a fire get in the woods a little bit, and the fire chief happened by. He came out, but I chased him off, and we finished up what we had to do. When we're burning with, and we do sometimes when we're burning, we may flail mow a perimeter around the edge of the field. That flail mowed ground will help keep the fire from going into the woods or where it's not supposed to be. Bush hogging fields doesn't seem to help with the burning. Maybe sickle mowing or disc mowing a field in the fall or through the winter will help carry the fire some in the spring. The burning with oil that we do runs us, right now, oil hasn't been too expensive, so it's running us around $400 to $500 an acre. And I use about 100 gallons of oil to the acre to get it to burn off, like you're talking about, to burn off the mummy berries and try to get into the duff and burn off any insect eggs, overwintering insects. And burning with oil, like I said, runs us $400 to $500 now. But when the price of oil is up, it may run as high as $700 to the acre to burn with oil. But we do find that even after burning one cycle and then going back to flail mowing, the mummyberry just is still terrible. So we're burning as a disease control and an insect control now, and we're doing somewhere, several hundred acres, which not many people are doing anymore. So I do it. I'm doing it every cycle, but I have some landowners that don't want to pay the price, and they're flail mowing themselves, and I can expect their yield to be pretty low. I hate to even try to get them harvested. So with the organics, it's like David Yarbrough's research showed, by burning you pretty much double your yield over flail mowing alone. So that's what we do.
Perfect. There's a question here. What is the best way for a first timer to burn? Do we need to learn by helping out an experienced grower's crew? I would say yes. Please reach out and we'll connect you to a grower. But what do you guys think?
Yeah, I had a fellow that just bought a burner come out and kind of watch us burn some last fall. I tried to give him a few pointers, and he just watched what we were doing, and it was a fairly dry day last fall. So he watched a while, and hopefully he learned something. And I burned for other people for years before I had my own fire, and that first fire is the only one we had to call the fire department for. And I learned a lot from that, since it was the first fire I was in charge of. But it's easy to let it get away, especially like Nicolas was talking about with those low humidity days when you can really get it to burn. Which if you're not using an oil burner, you have to use the optimal day. You don't want to spread all of that straw and then light a fire and not have it burn very well. It just goes to waste.
Right. And
him to come here.
Ruth and Nick, can you folks, can you mute yourselves if there's some background noise? Thanks. So Ruth and Nicolas are saying in the chat that you can contact them and maybe join a burn, which is very generous.
If there were time right now, Lily, I could kind of outline how we do a burn, but
sure, yeah, go ahead.
Just 2 minutes anyway. In the right-hand picture, you kind of see that there's a swath, and that's what we do first. We burn about a 20-foot swath around the outside of the field. And/or, like Cary said, if we can flail mow that perimeter first, that really helps. But you basically need to create a fire break first. So if we haven't been able to mow because the field's too rocky, like I said, some of our fields are, we'll use our crew to burn that 20-foot swath around the outside first. And you usually start at the downwind end and put it out as you go along. So that's what you see in the picture on the left is a crew of folks putting the inside edge of the perimeter out as I go along, setting that 20-foot swath. And then there's another crew of 2 to 3 on the outside edge, putting out that outer edge. And we move around the field first until we get to a point where I say we can just let it burn into the middle. So, 90% of your day is spent burning that perimeter, and then the last 10% of the time, the whole rest of the field goes up instantly, practically, if you have good conditions.
Yeah, and we're a little more reckless. We sometimes we'll try to use a road as a fire break, and if I can get the wind blowing just right, we just may burn a section of the field and just go on the through the field and let the fire burn to the road and just let it go. And hope the road stops it. Have somebody down there watching the other side for blowing sparks. And then we can go into some more of the field and start further up and let it go back to that. And like I said, sometimes if we have some snow still left on the edge of the field, sometimes it drifts up or the shade hits part of the field and the snow stays there. We'll burn a fire back against a snowbank. Seems to work. But, we just, and I know my crew was burned with another fella that did that, burn that perimeter 3 or 4 feet and put it out. They said it was really slow going. They got bored. So we try to make it a little more exciting, have a little risk of having the fire get away. So we try to let it go if we can. And when the fire's got the wind behind it, it burns off pretty well. When it's fighting against the wind, it just doesn't burn as well. So
right, you've both mentioned weather a lot, and I know. So if you can find a weather station near you, that would be ideal. Another really good resource is Courtney Hammond at Lindholm Farm. He used to work for the Forest Service on prescribed burns. So he's another resource who actually, and he shared that there are Forest Service weather stations that are used by the Forest Service to do these prescribed burns. So I will try to find the link, or maybe Brogan or Becky could try to find the link for that, put it in their chat. So this slide just shows, you know, I have been asked a few times from people who want to build their own burner or improve a burner and how to do that. I'm not an engineer. Extension is actually hiring an ag engineer, which is fantastic. And hopefully that person could work on something like this. But in general, my understanding is that the blue flame is the most efficient flame and it's the hottest flame. So ideally, you would want to have a blue flame that had very little smoke coming off the field. And that's just not really what we see in a blueberry field when it's burning. We see a lot of smoke and red to orange flames. Anyway, the burners that we have are okay. I don't know what you guys think about them. I know Cary's burner is a big, scary monster. Okay, so Nicolas does not burn with oil. You burn with straw, but how do you start the fire? Oh, you've written it, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I wasn't quite clear on the question. Yeah, I do light that perimeter burn with a drip torch that I have about a 50-50 mix of diesel kerosene.
Okay.
But also just kind of another statement about, you know, how tightly we try and control the burn is also indicative of how concerned we are of the ecosystem around the perimeter of our fields. A lot of it is woods, but a lot of our fields also have hedgerows, and we're encouraging the biodiversity in those hedgerows. So there's lots of plant material that is habitat for insects and birds and other life important to the health of a organic field. Plants that include aronia, pin cherry, winterberry, that sort of thing. So that's another reason we try and keep a really tight, especially outside of the field edge control. But like Cary, I also have had one burn in 22 years get out of control, and I learned a lot from that one incident, and that's actually why we are a lot more strict.
Yeah, perfect. Does anyone have a question about burning for Nicolas or Cary?
We do find with the oil burning, we are able to go out when it's a little damp, or when there's even frost on the ground, and burn perimeter. We can go around the perimeter when it's a little damp. The fire is easy to control. Have to drive really slow, use more oil, but you can get that perimeter burned. And like Nicolas has talked about, once you burn the perimeter, then burning the inside of that's relatively easy. It looks like on your picture here, Lily, with that blue flame, that actually looks like a propane flame. Yeah. I don't know if that's heating oil.
I think it is.
I don't know if heating oil even comes out of my furnace with a nice blue flame like that.
No,
so,
no, I don't think it would.
I burned with propane before, and the liquid propane. I just have to drive slower. I can't get enough heat out of that. The BTUs in the liquid propane does not equal the BTUs in like the oil. So I've got an old propane burner out here. It needs to be rebuilt, and I just haven't bothered rebuilding it because it is a little more slower to burn with liquid propane. But then again, you've got that big 500-gallon tank on the liquid propane, and you can burn, 5-6 hours before you have to refill. With the oil burner, I have to refill the tank on the burner about once an hour. Like I said, we burn about 100 gallons to the acre of number 2 heating oil, and the tank holds about 150 gallons. So about every hour. So we're burning about 2 gallons a minute to get that flame and get that burn like you see on the bottom picture there. It's quite a rig. So, but and actually once you get the outside perimeter burned, it gets kind of boring burning the inside. You just drive around slow. We're only able to drive at about 1.7 to 2.2 miles an hour most of the time with that burner to get it to burn off.
So watch out for Cary in the spring and fall. That's the lesson here.
I want to come join you, Cary, at some point. I'd love to do a wild burn. But I would also just point out, Lily, you know, as far as I keep my eye on Uncle Henry's or whatever for used equipment, it's hard to find. I've never seen an oil burner for sale. And, you know, John Deere, Kubota doesn't make them. So they're hard to find just for anyone who's, you know, getting into it thinking they're going to go out and buy all this equipment or something. An oil burner is hard to find. And I'd love to hear people input as to where you might find one if you're interested.
Interesting. Very good point. I know some people who have started out are using propane, so maybe those are easy to get. Cary, what is the brand of tractor mounted burner you're using?
We burn, one burner is hauled behind a John Deere and another burner is hauled behind a New Holland. I burned for years with an open station. A company I dealt with said not to use a cab because it got so hot it would pop out the windows. But we use cabs now, and it's so much nicer. You don't have the smoke around you. We've only lit the cab on fire once, so any tractor that's well, these days it'd have to be 60, 70 horsepower and weigh, you know, like 7,000 or 8,000 pounds to be able to drag that around and not have the burner push you going down a hill and be able to drag the burner uphill. So you need a little bit of size, and most of the burners around are like those 3-tube burners, like in your picture. There are some with 4 tubes or maybe more. I've never seen any with less than the 3 tubes. And the burner itself, I had to figure, filled with oil, it must weigh 5,000 pounds maybe. So it's quite a rig to haul behind a machine.
Does the burner itself have a name or a brand?
Yeah, one of mine does. It's a Woolery. But I'm pretty sure that Zane, I don't know if Zane Emerson's still making equipment or not, but Zane Emerson at Blueberry Equipment Company was making burners. And I thought there were a bunch around now because people aren't burning much anymore. A lot of them, I think mine were probably made back in the 50s. They're really old, and I've put on new engines and basically rebuilt everything there is to them. And I just saw a question. We generally start burning in the fall if it's dry. As soon as the leaves fall off the plants, we try to let the plants naturally senesce and let the leaves pretty much fall off. And that indicates that the plants have dried out some. If we try to burn with the leaves on it, we'll use more oil. And I've burned, when the snow's off the ground, I've burned in December, January, February. Anytime we can when it's warm, when the snow's gone and the temperature gets warm enough so that our water to control any problems doesn't freeze up. And we've done it before when we've had to put back pumps in the cab of the pickups to keep them from freezing. And then, of course, in the spring we start burning as soon as the fields are dry enough and the snow disappears. And I know Frank Drummond says that you can burn up until like sometime in June or something, but by the time that you get up and not have a big yield loss, but by the time that you get up to the leaves coming out, the plants start to get a lot of moisture in them. It makes it very difficult to burn once the plants start to get a lot of moisture and form leaves. And it does set your crop back a lot if you're not burning until June. So, and one of the horticulturalists, one of the big companies, did some research and showed that yields begin to drop off in that particular yield year after the 15th of April, which seemed pretty early. But he did the research, and so if we can, we'd love to get finished in April. But like Nicolas said, there was 2 years ago, we never had our first fire until the first day of May. And so we didn't finish up until the last day of May. But last year we were able to start in the 22nd of March, and we finished up the first week or so of May, which was really nice.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Thanks. So we'll move on to mowing. So flail mowers are the other way to prune your field, and the fields do need to be pruned every other year. Your yield will decrease with every year that you do not prune. There have been times when a crop can't be pruned either by burning or mowing, and the crop gets set back. That may mean that city is not harvesting that year. And I get a question often, should you prune then during the summer and just start the clock over? Or should you wait and get a second crop out of it? So it depends what happened. If you had a late frost, for example, and you're not gonna get a crop, I would prune the field so that your next year is the prune year. And well, I would prune in the fall and just reset the clock so that you still have a 2-year cycle. I hope that makes sense. And so flail mowing, people ask, do I have to use a flail mower? Well, you want to use a flail mower because you need to get as close to the ground as possible. And so this is what you want it to look like after you mow. You really want close to the ground, chopped debris. And the reason for that is because we want to have the shoots growing from the rhizomes that are underground, not from old shoots. And the next picture shows that. But the benefit of mowing is that you're building organic matter, and the downside is that you will have more pests, insects, diseases, weeds in these fields compared to if you burned. And as we mentioned, burning can burn off your organic matter, but actually something we didn't touch on in burning, often, Cary and Nicolas, I hear the word, I burned too hot or too hard. And to somebody new, I don't think, we don't know what that means. Do you guys have a way to articulate that, or anything to say about burning too hard?
I would just generally say it's an issue with oil or propane burning, not so much with straw, but it's basically implying that you're burning too much, a higher percentage of that duff layer than you really should or need to. Anywhere from, what Cary and I said, 50 to 80 bales per acre of straw probably will not give you too hot a burn.
Okay, great.
In general. Yeah, I mean, and I would also speak to the fact that burning, of course, you're releasing all kinds of carbon back into the atmosphere and causing pollution. So in a climate change perspective, it's not ideal. But as an organic grower, as I already said, it's a necessary tool for certain pest and disease and weed cycles.
Yeah, and great. I'm glad you brought that up. That is the reason why people stopped burning. It was an air pollution issue, and it was also becoming very expensive with the price of oil increasing. But the switch to mowing was a real plus for the environment. And, spot burning, we didn't quite touch on, but spot burning can be a good tool to burn less of the field if you have a certain area that has a lot of mummyberry or flea beetle. During the season, you could spot burn that area to eliminate that pest and to reduce its spread. And I think people are doing that on occasion. Okay, so when you burn or mow, you want your shoots to come up from the rhizomes like that, or right from underground, which is what you see here. You really don't want a burn to not burn the whole stem from last year. So you can have situations where a shoot comes up out of this, out of a little shoot that was from last year. And the reason for that is because we want to have straight stems, because straight stems will get more light and they'll also be easier to harvest. And I would think it would help with airflow. If you don't have a lot of different angled stems, you're going to have better airflow, which is good for disease management. So I think this is the graph that Cary was talking about. So the systems study that I've mentioned, my predecessors worked on, this study showed that burning plus sulfur gives you the highest yield. And highest yield ended up being 2,000 kilograms per hectare, which is 1,700 pounds per acre. So compared to mowing plus sulfur and compared to just burning, the burning and sulfur was the best way to go.
If I can chime in,
Yeah.
I think that's fairly accurate. But even with the burning and the sulfur in a given year, we've had fields that yield as low as 500 pounds the acre, and other fields that will yield over 6,000 pounds the acre. Not entirely sure why. Bees on everything, somewhere up around 3 hives to the acre. Burning and sulfur, and still just didn't get much for berries. It could have been animal damage, could have been any number of things, and I just wasn't positive. It may have been a combination of things why the yield is so low. But even in the organic fields, we can get oftentimes our yields are in that 2,000 to 3,000 pound range with the burning and the sulfur. And it's not just sulfur. You do have to do a lot of soil sampling. We're doing the testing ourselves now rather than sending it out, so we're able to test a lot more in the fields and get a lot better picture of what we have for pH out there. And you know, if you're going to put on sulfur, you really need to know which pH is and how much you should put on, and maybe you're going to get into that. But anyhow, this is entirely accurate for maybe a lower yielding field.
Great. Thanks, Cary. And now I'll move on to share some results from our weed survey. I'll move along here because this discussion is the best part. So this is where we did this weed survey over 2 years. We had a graduate student who took this on and visited 20 fields, half of which were organic, half were conventional. And the main takeaway was that 68% of the weed species out there are perennials, which is not a surprise, but it's nice to put a number on it. And since the latest weed survey in Maine in 1989 that Dave Yarbrough did, we have an increased diversity of weed species. And that could be for a few different reasons. You know, we have new weeds coming here, but we also have changed the way that we manage fields. And for the conventional farms, we have changed the types of products that are used as herbicides for, and also burning or mowing has changed. So there have been changes. This is a tough table to read, but as you can see here, this is the most frequent weeds that we found in 2019 at the top and 2020 at the bottom. And you can see the organic fields have similar weeds to the conventional fields, but in a little bit of a different order. the organic fields tend to have more frequent weeds than the conventional fields, but both fields have weeds. And so we have red sorrel and bunchberry showing up a lot as these creeping low canopy weeds. And then we also have the ones in orange that are labeled as summer perennials that are, so these would be weeds that are above the canopy. And so spreading dogbane is common in our fields, as is goldenrod, and goldenrod rises to the top in 2020. And I want to mention that goldenrod can be a really good habitat for bees, especially in the fall when there isn't a lot of other forage for bees. So, you know, it depends on how much goldenrod you have in your field and what species you have. There are a lot of species of goldenrod. And don't ask me to identify them because they're very difficult to tell apart. But if you have a serious clump of it and it's taking over your field, then yeah, maybe you would want to get rid of it. But if you have, you know, a few stems of species that's very tall and skinny, then you might want to consider if that's worth keeping, because maybe it's a better as a habitat than to get rid of it. So it's up to you. I would strongly consider managing weeds. You need to manage them to get any blueberries, but there are these other benefits, as Nicolas was saying, for insect and pollination management. Now, when we look at surface area, we have a very similar story. So we have bunchberry and goldenrod at the top of the list for the weeds that take up the most surface area in organic fields. So I will move into some ways to manage weeds organically. The first tactic is to cut herbaceous weeds before they go to seed with a weed whacker or hand weeding. Hand weeding is still done, but it is very labor intensive and expensive. So if you can get out there with a weed whacker or to spot mow sections, whatever works for you, that would be the time to do that is before the herbaceous perennials go to seed. So before they flower or just before they flower, because you want to cut them back when the plant has put a lot of energy above ground. So right as it's about to flower, that's the point when it has put the most energy into reproduction, and that's the best time to cut them off. So you want to remove the most energy possible. And so for something like dogbane, that can work. However, we're doing a study on dogbane that I think those graphs are in here. They're coming up. It may not work with dogbane because the patch can actually spread. So depends on the weed, but in general, you want to cut these herbaceous weeds before they go to seed. And Dave did a study in that same system study that Becky just linked to, which is great in the chat. You can read the whole thing if you want. He found that 3 cuts of the woody weeds will really reduce those plants. So woody weeds meaning white birch or willow. Here, this graph shows that the height decreased with the number of cuttings and the number of stems decreased with the increased number of cuttings. So by the third cut, there's like hardly anything left for white birch. And then for willow, there's a similar story. You may have a lot of stems still shooting up, but overall your height is decreasing and you're starving out the plant slowly. Getting out there 3 times during the season might be hard, but it's good to do. Dave's on the call. Do you have anything else to say?
Yeah, maybe you mentioned it, but you want to do this cutting on the non-cropping year.
Oh yeah.
You know, on the vegetative year. If you try to, and I've had some people do it on the cropping year, they've gone out and done some trimming or some pulling and left the weeds out there, and it's a real hindrance for the harvesting. So the non-cropping year is really important to get out and either pull weeds or cut. I did do some work pulling weeds, and it takes on a really good field without much for weeds. It took us takes 6 or 7 hours an acre to go out and pull weeds. We bag them up and hold them off the field. And to trim those fields, it takes us maybe 1 to 4 hours, depending on how bad the weeds are. And if you go over it 3 times, you can figure that it's 3 to 12 hours total an acre. So both of those things are time consuming, but it's well worth it if you can get out and do anything to pull weeds or trim weeds.
Yeah, I'll agree with that totally, and just say that we've now basically instituted a regimen of going out during the prune cycle in June, July, and September with the weed whacker and mowing everything above the blueberry canopy. I mean, everything, because that's not only the way to control saplings like the birches, but also bracken fern, and that can just, you're knocking down all the perennial weeds, just drawing their energy out. So that's what we do now with the weed whacker 3 times, June, in the prune cycle.
Great. Anyone have any questions about cutting weeds?
And we actually use a bigger weed whacker type of thing. It's more of a brush saw, and put a 3-sided steel blade onto that, and then that's able to cut the woody weeds. It'll also cut the bracken fern, the goldenrod, and all of that too. So we use those.
And what about sweet fern? Those can be really thick patches. Will cutting work with those as well?
Yeah, that 3-sided steel blade, and we use steel brush saws, and that will cut through it'll cut through any of the sweet fern that we found. Sometimes it's a little difficult when it's really thick, but it will cut that stuff. String just won't even touch it, and so go to steel.
Great. And here are the dogbane cutting graphs. We just started this experiment last year, so we decided we would look at the same thing Dave did, but with dogbane, since it's a different type of weed. And the more times we cut it, the patch actually increased in radius. And it's important that we go back in the second year to see if the weed patch is more vigorous or not. So that's upcoming information for you, but the stem number per patch also increased. So some plants, as you cut them, they will be triggered and stimulated to produce more shoots. And I think that's what's happening here. But in general, please do cut your weeds. The next weed management tactic is to reduce your soil pH, which we have talked about. Cary mentioned it. You do want to apply elemental sulfur, but Cary, you mentioned that there's a specific organic approved sulfur. Do you know the name of that?
There's a whole bunch of sulfur that's OMRI approved. Okay. We actually, the first time we did manage to get a list from MOFGA. We do certify through MOFGA of different sulfurs we could use, and I talked to several of the suppliers and get a price for organic sulfur. The sulfur comes in with that OMRI label, which we have to keep a bag to show the inspector for the certification. But they're all aware of what you want for organic sulfur, the suppliers, and I tried to get it straight from the producer, and I have to go through an agent of some sort. So I call all of the pesticide guys around. I don't have my list here in front of me, but Brian McCleary is a real good one. Mm-hmm. They've changed their name a couple of times. And we actually get in a truckload at a time, so it helps with the price a little bit.
Yes.
That's great.
I believe it is.
If you can, folks, if you can mute yourselves. Looks like Emily, you're talking at us. You can ask a question if you need. Thanks.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Quicker than typing, I was madly trying to type it. If you're going to use sulfur, is there, like, when you apply it, do you have to stay off the field? You know, how long does it take to kind of soak in, you know, be absorbed by the ground plant? If you've got to do more than 100 pounds, I saw that for 1/10 of a point, like, do you apply it in one fell swoop?
Yeah.
What time of year? I see the not frozen or saturated, but sorry, I'll shut up.
Yeah, no, good questions. All of the answers to your questions are on this fact sheet that we made specifically to answer those on pH management under the weeds section of the website. But you want to apply it. So first question was, yes, you can walk on it right away, no problem. It is a pellet, so it's going to take some time to dissolve, and you need rain or moisture to get these pellets to dissolve. It takes 2 to 3 years to get the sulfur to reduce the pH of the soil to your goal of however much you put on. The amount of sulfur, so yeah, most people are applying much more than 100 pounds in one go. So I know Dave Yarbrough had, you know, he would say, yeah, apply the whole amount. You can apply up to 1,000 pounds per acre. But some people say that's too much and it can burn the plants. So you may consider reducing that, you know, not applying more than 500 or 800 per acre at a time. So yeah, it can be a lot of material, but once you get your UMaine soil testing lab test back, like, so the first few times you should send in the soil sample to the lab in Orono, and they'll send you back your pH level and the amount of sulfur that you should put on, based on this fact that 100 pounds reduces the pH by 1/10 of a point. After that, like Cary's saying, they're measuring pH on their own because they're doing so much of it. And that makes sense too. You can buy a pH meter and do it yourself. I wouldn't use the pH strips. They're not as accurate, but sometime we should do a pH workshop where we teach you how to do that yourselves.
Yeah. Speaking of that, with pH meters, we actually had 2 or 3, maybe 3 before we finally found one that's accurate and we can use. It's a little more expensive. I think it comes from Hanna Instruments, and we have to use distilled water to keep it calibrated properly. We have to use distilled water to mix with the soil. My wife actually does all of that testing, so I take samples sometimes, but she does that. And we're able to go in and test, you know, every 3 or 4 acres. We really don't do much more than every 3 or 4 acres, but we're able to do a lot more than what we'd be able to gather up and send to the university. And we get our results back right away. A question from Robin about the sulfur and when you can walk on it. It's not the organic sulfur is a soil amendment. It's not a pesticide of any kind. It does not have any restrictions about when you can enter the field and have to wear protective equipment. But a lot of times dumping it, you're probably better off to wear some kind of an N95 or at least some kind of face covering because it is quite dusty covering it. And I've actually seen the pellets from where we spread it on the surface of the field 2 years later, where it has not dissolved in. I don't know if that was just the supplier that I got it from and how it was mixed, but it didn't spread in so much. And on some soils, I've seen results in the first crop. I put it on in the non-cropping year, I'd like to do it before the plants come up if I can. I don't always get that done, so I'm even doing it in the fall, in September sometimes. You have to do it when the leaves are not wet, just like it says here. You have to do it when they're dry so that the sulfur does not stick to the leaves and burn the leaves of the wild blueberry plants. It gets down to the ground, and I've had results after putting that on in the non-cropping year. The very next crop, the next year, I've done away with a lot of the grasses. When I put on sulfur in 2019 for the 2020 crop, I don't know if it was the weather or what, but I didn't get hardly any results. Everybody keeps telling me that I've got to wait that 2 to 3 years. So I'm still hoping that my grass is gone by the next crop in 2022.
In general, sulfur does a really good job at reducing the grasses, including fescue, but fescue is a tough grass. So yeah, we have trouble managing certain species of fescue, but in general, grasses are well managed by the sulfur. I have a pH meter right here. So this is what it looks like. And it has a probe. It has a probe on the bottom. And you would stick this in a cup with your soil and water, and you kind of stir it and let it sit. You do want to make sure that you can calibrate this. So you should read the directions. I won't go into the whole thing, but maybe we'll do a workshop on how to do this another time. And this is a Hanna instrument probe as well. So Hanna Instruments, we can put the link in the chat.
Yeah,
Yeah,
just a
go ahead.
comment.
Go ahead.
On the differences, like Cary is finding one field would get results early, other fields take a few years. That had to do with, what Ivan talked about with the cation exchange capacity. Different soils have different buffering abilities. So that 1/10 of a point is kind of an average. And that would be, some fields it might take a lot more and other fields take a lot less.
Okay. And that would have to do with your soil type?
Yeah, it had to do, some soils are heavier. Excuse me. Some soils are heavier than others, so they have a better buffering capacity. So it may actually take more sulfur and take longer to do it. Other soils are lighter and would have less capacity, so you'd see the progress fairly soon. But the other issue too is when you're applying it, you have to really be sure to get an even application. We did have a fact sheet that kind of covered that you would want to put about 50% of the sulfur on and overlap it 50%, so you wouldn't get spots in your field that had too lower pH and other spots that didn't have a higher pH. So that's another real important point when putting sulfur down.
Yeah, great. Go
Throw out,
ahead.
just from experience, you can apply it right after you prune, as Cary indicated, but especially right after you burn. You can, the ground is black and bare, so you see the pellets really clearly. That's ideal, because then you're also getting that burn plus sulfur effect, but just for visually seeing it. And I've never been able to economically justify what Dave just recommended of actually spreading half of it, like basically taking twice the amount of time. I've always just spread it at the rate that is going down once, and I try and do it so I can visually see and get as even an overlap as possible. So that's just where we're at our experience.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I do follow what Dave said. He's been the guru for years, but if my recommendation is to get down to a 4.2 for a pH. A lot of fields are around a 4.8, 4.9, something. A lot of fields I end up putting about 700 pounds to the acre on. I put it all on at the same time, but I do make the 2 passes. And the way that I do it is just go out and of course around the perimeter, it's hard to make 2 different passes. So I go around the perimeter, and some of my sulfur ends up in the stone wall, or maybe off the edge a little too far. But then I set out only halfway and do my 2 passes that way. I only set out half and go over it twice to get up to my 700 pounds the acre, 350 each pass. And we do find that it doesn't cause any problem if we put on the whole recommended amount all at once. It gets it done that season rather than having to wait for the next season.
Okay, great. Yeah, so you do want to calibrate your spreader if you can. Cary mentioned that he just opens it up a little bit, and that's good enough. So.
No. There's a with my sprayers. Both of my sprayers, I think, were made like in Italy or somewhere, and the owner's manuals were written in Italian, translated to German, then translated back to Portuguese, and then finally to English or something like that. So they're not real clear, but the way it's really hard to calibrate a spreader. I have a pie plate type spreader, and now I use a Vicon type, a Citrex with a dogtail that sticks out. And part of what I did was I went out and just opened the spreader a little bit. It's got a handle so you can tell how far you're open. It's got numbers on it and all. So I opened it up a little bit, and I did a known area, and I saw how much I was doing and made sure that I didn't put on too much because I could always go over it again. And so I knew how much I put on, and then I could go back and apply, another dose to get it up to what I wanted to, or even 2 more times. And then the next field where I knew a known area, I could, if I needed to, I could open it up a little bit more and spread that field and see if I used the proper amount, and then go over it again if I had to. And you could do that if you know exactly how big your field is. If you want to try it on it's hard to try it on a small scale because you're spending so much time turning and going back through that 1 acre area. So I just made sure that I did not open my spreader too much and put on way too much when I started calibrating.
I just add record keeping is crucial, and so just over time, I always my Citrex spreader has a number page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that opens up, and so just through time and good record keeping and knowing the size of your field and how much you're aiming to spread. That's the only guide that I have now at this point is my own records.
Hey Lily, it's Shannon. Can I say something?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, we've never spread sulfur, but we have a Vicon spreader that we have in the past spread fertilizer, and it came with a little slide rule, because when you're spreading fertilizer, unlike sulfur, you want to be pretty accurate. There's not as much of a kind of a leeway there, but it is just a mathematical calculation with the little slide rule that comes with the Vicon. So there is a way, if you're using a newer spreader like that you can pretty much say, depending upon how you set it, how much you're applying without having to put it down and then calculate the acreage and figure out how much you got down.
Great. Thanks, Shannon.
One more thing.
Yep.
and if you are spreading organic sulfur, you need to clean that spreader with pressure washer, approved organic cleaning solution. If you go from spreading fertilizer to spreading organic sulfur, and like you said, most organic people are not spreading sulfur, but I do know, because I did use this spreader for sulfur for fertilizer before. Of course, it's been fully cleaned and sprayed out and scrubbed down with a brush and my solution, but the rate that it puts out of fertilizer at the same setting is different than the rate that it puts out of sulfur at the same setting. So all of those different things do go out at different rates depending on their specific gravity and the pellet shape. So you do have to be careful with what you're putting out. And with the sulfur, you know, if it calls for 700 pounds to the acre, you know, if you get 600, if you get 800, it's not that big of a deal. But the sulfur does cost, when we get a truckload, it's running us like 32 cents a pound. So for every 100 pounds you're off, you know, you may be wasting $32 an acre, or you may not get the weed control or grass control that you're looking for if you're not putting on, you know, the right amount.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And we do at about 700 pounds the acre. The cost is running us, you know, somewhere around $230 to $270 an acre for the sulfur and the application. So the application does cost something. You know, it's another $30 to $40 an acre for the application, dumping the material and spreading it out with the tractor and spreader. But the cost of the sulfur is quite expensive when you're talking 32 cents a pound for 700 pounds an acre. You know, you're talking $227 an acre just for the sulfur. But you mentioned before that it will last 8 to 10 years. That's 4 to 5 crops. And I've actually had pretty good weed control and a fairly low pH for as many as 12 years, maybe even 14. So it does last quite a long time. It's not quite like spraying Velpar or Callisto or some of the herbicides, but it does do the job.
Yep. Okay, great. I think we'll move on. We have a lot more to cover. So I just want you to know that we update pest management charts every year. And at the top of these charts is a cultural weed management table. And this is the one for weeds. There's one for insects and diseases. So this is a really good table for you. The bottom part of it is all of the pesticides, and some are organic. Most of them are not. Okay, so tine weeding is a research project that we've been doing. I'm going to breeze through this. Tine weeding is a weed management tool. It's a mechanical weed management tool. It's basically like dragging a fork through the ground to dislodge very young seedlings in the early spring. And so we've now tried this for 2 years in the prune year and the crop year. Doing it in the prune year is the best way to go. But this tactic isn't going to solve all of your weed problems. It will dig out some weeds, such as this beautiful root of a Canadian Mayflower. So it does this once in a while, but the tines are so spread out that you're going to miss certain weeds. So it's something we tried. I don't think it's a silver bullet at all. It will dig up the blueberry a little bit, and we've been looking at both the what happens to the blueberry and the weeds when we do this. So this is percent change of blueberry cover in blue, weed cover in light green, and weed number in dark green. And you can see that the control that was not tine weeded at all has more weeds than the plots that we tine weeded with 2 passes, so down and back, or with 4 passes, down and back, down and back. We wanted to get a sense of how many times can we do this and how damaging to the blueberry is it going to be. So it's clearly more damaging to the weeds than it is to the blueberry. But so the more you do it, the more weeds you lose, but also the more it's going to hurt your blueberry crop. Last year, our first year of data, our preliminary data showed that there might be some stimulation of the roots when you do this. And we didn't quite see that trend this year, but it is known that cutting through the sod of wild blueberry does stimulate root growth. And so in this chart, you can see we tracked the number of flowers, the number of green fruit, the number of buds per stem, and the number of blue fruit through the season with under all these different treatments. So the thing that stands out is really the black bars that are that were timed in the crop year. And don't do this in the crop year. It's not a good picture. You have less fruit, and yeah, when you prune tine or tine in the prune year, we did see that when you just go with the 2 passes on one date in early May, we actually saw more flowers per stem, but then that trend didn't quite follow through the whole season, although we didn't see a significant drop in yield at the end. So it's something to keep studying, and we will. The other part of this project is that we're looking at winter kill cover cropping for weed management in organic fields. And the idea here is that you could plant a winter kill cover crop such as oats or pearl millet that are seeded in the fall after you harvest, or really in the summer. It's really like you need to seed these in August, right after you harvest, to get them to germinate, to develop enough organic matter to then die and drop to the ground, produce or provide some organic matter for the following year. And there's this possibility that if you seed it at a high enough rate, you could smother some weeds. We haven't seen this yet because our seeding rate was too low, but that's why we're trying this before you should try it. And the other thing is that we planted too late. So in this situation, we harvested on August 17th, and we planted the seeds on September 1st, which was way late. And this photo was taken on October 9th. So these are pretty small. They're not really going to produce much biomass at all, but they did germinate in our low pH soil, which is good and encouraging. Now, I'll leave it at that. So we can move on. Now I have Becky to talk about her project. And why don't we let her go through the slides and then we can ask some questions.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'll be talking about mulching as it relates to a project that we did this past summer for my thesis project. And so hopefully you learned something new. Hopefully this is helpful. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with mulching, but if not, I'll give you some background. So there are a lot of different types of mulch. Mulch is generally any layer of a material applied to the top of the soil rather than incorporating it into the soil. So you can have inorganic kinds like plastic tarps, but that's not really feasible in wild blueberry since it's not a row crop. But there are other organic materials. So in this photo, you can see we used organic pine mulch, so a softwood mulch. You can use either softwood or hardwood mulches, but I've heard that hardwoods often tend toward alkalinity, so they tend to make soils alkaline as they degrade, while softwoods can acidify the soil. So that would be good for blueberry soils that like that acidic type of soil. Hardwoods can also sour more often if they are sitting in a pile, depending on how they're stored. If they have anaerobic conditions, that can sour them. So it might be good to just stick with softwoods, but it depends on the availability and what you want to invest in. Some people might also be able to chip their own wood, so that's always good. In general, there are a lot of benefits too that come with mulching. when you're adding this organic matter, it can help conserve soil moisture, which increases the water holding capacity of your soil and allows more nutrients to enter the soil solution, making them more available for plant uptake. It also prevents weed establishment and stimulates rhizome growth. It can prevent frost heaving, moderates the soil temperatures, and can reduce soil erosion. And it also supports habitat for biodiversity. So like we've been talking, it can benefit all aspects of the environment in your field. So ultimately, it can encourage the blueberry growth and their vigor. If you want to go to the next slide, Lily. So another benefit, it's known that mulching by applying a minimum of 1.5 to 2 inches can, with a thickness between 1.5 to 2 inches, that can cover mummy berries and prevent germination. And that's usually done right before bud break in plants, and that can improve their vigor again. The easiest time to put down mulch, though, is right after pruning, so before plants emerge again. It can be expensive in terms of material that you use, unless, like I said, you have your own source, and it can be labor intensive with regards to spreading that mulch, but I have a cost table of how much it costs for us to apply our treatments. And like I said, it has the advantage of providing other benefits like that water retention and increasing plant vigor and growth. And it can be a useful option for those where irrigation is limited or just not possible. So in the bottom photos, you can see on the right was an irrigated conventional field. So you can see the plants are a little bit more lush there compared to the organic field on the left, the not organic photo. Plants are a little bit less lush, but I put that box in there. I'm not sure if Lily has the source. I had a bit of trouble finding the exact study that these photos came from, but I think they applied mulch where I outlined that red shape there. And you can see those plants are a little bit more lush. So again, just pointing out.
Dave Rose on the call. I think they're definitely his photos.
Okay. I don't know
if you wanted to chime in. Anyway,
right.
Here we go.
Okay, well, that was that for that slide. Lily, if you want to move on, or if Dave wants to chime in.
It's just a slow computer, sorry.
Sorry. No, mine is also it's also been having some problems. We'll give it a second. But I'll just add some background for the project that we did this past summer based on typical recommendations of wood mulch. Those recommendations are that you apply mulch in between 2 and 4 inches thick to fill in bare spots. So that would be in patches across fields. But our project aimed at looking at a shallower thickness with the potential to apply across an entire field to achieve those benefits that I talked about, while also being a little bit more cost efficient. And so these are the treatments that we used at an organic field site in Maine. And so from left to right, you can see we had the control, sawdust, shavings, bark mulch, and then wood chips all the way over to the right. And we're also looking at the difference in particle size of those mulches. So from left to right, it was control, and then the smallest particle size in sawdust up to the largest size with those big wood chunks. And we're looking at how that might affect soil moisture along with the other benefits that mulch provides. And that's especially interesting because with this last summer, regarding changes in our climate and different weather patterns, it was actually the 3rd warmest in Maine for the period between June and August, and the 14th driest in Maine since 1895. So this would be a really good option for growers to try to mitigate those challenges presented by the changing weather. So we saw a lot of drought this past summer. But on the next slide, it shows the treatment costs. So as I said, it can be expensive, but in comparison to irrigating, depending on how you irrigate and what you would use for that, your investment costs would be between $40,000 and $185,000. Oh, my light just went off. Your investment could be a quite large investment. But you can see here, I have the cost per acre of all of these treatments. They were sold in different units. So sawdust and shavings were by the cord, bark mulch and wood chips were by the cubic yard, but they are the equivalent of each other. So the 14 cords was about the same as 67 cubic yards. And we got these from a local lumber company. So if it might be more cost effective for you to go to a local lumber company or something like that to get them as byproducts rather than going to like Home Depot or a garden center. So that's just a summary if anybody was wondering about the cost for that, if you're interested. And then on the next slide, it just shows another picture of our plot treatments and how we laid those out. And then on the following slide, yep. So I'll just get into some of the results. So this graph here is mean soil moisture from all of our data collected throughout the summer. So no treatment really outperformed the control, but as I said, it was a pretty dry summer. And what you see is that the sawdust and wood chips are two extreme particle sizes. The smallest and largest ones had the lowest soil moisture. But on the next graph, they did have higher averages for average stem height and number of buds per stem. So they could have been taking up more water, which would benefit the growth of those plants and possibly lower the local soil moisture. But again, you can see all of these bars are pretty similar. One of the most interesting results was with our disease density that we measured, which is on the next graph. And that just showed all of the treatments performed pretty similarly in effectively reducing disease, or the number of disease stems that we measured per area in quadrats in our plots. So even though particle sizes across the board were pretty similar, the thickness that we used, which was 1/2 inch, was pretty effective. And the primary disease that we measured was a leaf spot disease. So this was really good to know that if you are trying to target a disease that disperses by fungal spores, 1/2 inch might do well in mitigating that. So here is what that looks like. On the left are images of leaf spot, which we found in that field. And some of our conclusions, so like I said, this mulch thickness showed pretty good results at suppressing disease, although our weed and insect measurements were not significant. But we'll see how that plays out in this next summer, the crop year. And it was also interesting, I didn't include this graph because I didn't want to overwhelm everybody with a lot of graphs, but all the treatments had higher leaf chlorophyll content than the control, which is it correlates to nitrogen content in the leaf tissue. So that was really interesting to see that the mulches perhaps were providing higher nitrogen to the plants as it was decomposing, although it was the first year of this project. So we can't recommend anything yet, but we will see what happens this coming summer, how the weather is and what the yield looks like as well. But that brings me to the end of the mulch part of this talk. So if anybody has questions or if anybody wants to add anything, I didn't look in the chat.
Yep, there's one high-push question. Are leaves better than leaves okay compared to wood mulch? And I wouldn't say necessarily. It's certainly a different system, but typically softwood mulch is without, although there's discussion on whether hardwood would go away too. I would say, you know, the chlorophyll content being higher is a nice indicator. It matches up with the disease data too, because if you're not having as many leaf spots on the leaves, then those leaf spots are filled with chlorophyll, which is making your plant to photosynthesize more. It seems like the plants are just healthier with more access to water. Question, any comments on plastic? Well, you can't use plastic in a low bush blueberry field. Maybe you're talking about a high bush blueberry crop where you might be able to. I actually can't think of a high bush blueberry field that I've seen with any plastic. I'm not sure why. Probably because it's perennial and it'd be tough to get in there year after year. Plastic, because there's a perennial plant there. But for low, plastic is not a good idea. Their fields are too big. Thanks, Becky.
Yeah.
On to fertilizer.
Can I have just one question, Lily?
Yeah, go ahead.
Is this mulch study going to continue for another cycle at least? And also, you're just breaking up a lot. I wonder if maybe cutting out your video would help with your audio, just because I think your internet service is off.
Yeah, I don't know what Lily plans, but my thesis is this would be ending for me for this next summer. So yeah, it would be nice to have a couple cycles. I don't know what Lily thinks about that.
Yeah, we keep doing it for another 2 years, so we can have 4 years data. That'd be nice. It'll probably be less data collected because we won't have Becky around to woman the show. She's been very organized and very helpful. But yeah, we can keep collecting basic data. It is an important topic, and I know that CS is interested in, so I think there will be at least this study and possibly another one that might be bigger actually in the future. So we will continue with mulching.
So I'm going to be talking about fertilizer. I'm not sure if you switched slides yet, Lily, but we're still seeing disease.
Yeah,
so
switched, but...
There we go. All right, so fertilizer is any material of natural or synthetic origin that's applied to the soil or the plant tissues to supply one or more essential nutrients to the plants. So with wild blueberry, we typically apply granular fertilizer, so MAP or DAP. And then a few other methods that we're kind of reviewing right now are foliar fertilizer, so that's foliage applied liquid fertilizer, and these usually contain either macro or micronutrients in different ratios, or organic amendments, like Becky was just talking about, mulch, compost or soil additives, which add organic matter to the soil, and those slowly release nutrients over time, also feeding the plants. So if you could do the next slide, Lily, when you're ready. And I'll just start talking about that. So we have a foliar fertility trial that took place at BHF, and that was through 2019 and 2020. So that just concluded. And for this, we had two controls, one with nothing applied. We had a control with DAP. So that's our only solid or granular fertilizer in this whole study. And then everything you see below the DAP is a foliar fertilizer product. So you can see these have various ratios of macronutrients and micronutrients. And then a couple of them have plant growth regulators. So these are like a supplemental hormone, which have different modes of action in enhancing plant growth. So you see C-crop has cytokinin, and this promotes cell division. And then NanoGrow on that list has gibberellic acid, which promotes cell elongation. So these products were applied, some of them were applied in the prune year to target vegetative growth, and some were applied in the crop year to target reproductive growth. And that was based on manufacturer recommendations, who we got these foliar fertilizers from. And you can see the costs on the side. I will note that foliar fertilizers are typically applied more than once throughout the season. So we estimated this to be about once per month, although some recommend doing it with a particular stage of the crop, say fruit set or tip dieback. So the prices that you see on the far right, those are if you were to apply with 4 applications throughout your season, but these do not include labor or equipment. And then another interesting thing on this list before we move on is the nanocellulose. So we tested that this year. It's a material that's not commercialized or available for purchase, but it's currently being researched for potential applications. And it's a wood-derived fiber pulp that has been micro-refined to a nano level. So it's a wood fiber that has been split to several hundredths of a micron and smaller, and it almost makes a soft white gel that you add to your tank mixture. So we were testing that here as like a sticker, just to try and help the POMA, which we paired it with, which is calcium, better stick to the leaves and allow the blueberry to uptake it through that waxy cuticle. So we can go to the next slide, Lily, when you're ready. And I will note that out of all of these, the only organic product that's certified organic is the C crop. So here we have blueberry cover. We ended up splitting up the products applied in 2019 and 2020, just based on measurement dates and the 2 different targets of growth. So the top graph, this is averaged over 2019 and 2020. And you can see that DAP had a significantly higher blueberry cover than the foliar treatments and the control. And then for the 2020 applied products, because we were applying these a year later, but we had the earlier measurements, we were able to look at the pre-application blueberry cover and the post-application blueberry cover. So these weren't significant. And you can see that the control even increased, and that's likely just from estimating on a prune field versus a crop field. But the interesting part is that pretty much all of the foliar fertilizers in the 2020 applied products increased, which is cool. We can go to the next one, Lily. So here we also looked at pest pressure, and this is because pests can be attracted to certain supplemental nutrients that we're applying to the crops. So we have our treatments along the x-axis, and then weeds are in green, and this was the number of weeds per meter squared. And for disease and insect stems, so this is all 2020 data that we're looking at. This isn't including 2019. In 2020, we tried something new where we actually counted the number of stems that had disease damage, and we counted the number of stems with insect damage. So this is a little more quantitative, I guess, in a sense. But you can see here that weeds were pretty high in the control in the 2019 applied, but you can see the control. I will note the control is a little different in the crop applied, and that's due to measurement dates. So we had earlier measurement dates that occurred for the 2019 treatments that were prior to the 2020 measures, and so that was in May when weeds were higher and disease was lower. So you're looking at a little bit of an effective average there. However, let me get to the key points of this slide. Sorry. So weeds were surprisingly low in the DAP on that last slide. I will note that insect pressure, this was the key one, was highest in the DAP and agrophosphates. And that's likely due to the insect's attraction to phosphorus, which we're looking into or could be looked into further. And then disease pressure was not significant across those. So for this slide, we're looking at harvest yield, and harvest yield was not significant, but it's pretty interesting here because you can see the yield for DAP, NanoGrow, and POMA plus NanoGrow NanoGrow and POMA plus nanocellulose were quite a bit higher than the control. And for this slide, we also had some other noteworthy measurements which are in the reports, but winter kill was not significant, although I will note that winter kill was lowest for C crop, suggesting that C crop might have promoted bud hardening prior to winter. We counted buds, flower, number, green fruit, and blue fruit per stem. And these results varied, but POMA plus the nanocellulose, so plus that additive, did have the highest flower, green fruit, and blue fruit counts. And then chlorophyll concentration and photosynthetic rate were highest in C crop and POMA plus nanocellulose. We can go to the next one, Lily. So the system study that has been talked about quite a bit tonight, they did find in that study that Pro Holly was a viable organic alternative to DAP. And in this study, they just said that it was as effective as DAP in supplying nitrogen and phosphorus to the plants when the plants were nitrogen and phosphorus deficient. Potassium was not deficient in this study, but it can be presumed that Pro Holly does contain quite a bit of potassium and could potentially correct deficiency there as well. And then also with this study, they found that correcting the nitrogen and phosphorus deficiencies increased growth, stem branching, and bud formation. We can go to the next one. And so the next one is just a concluding slide for that trial. So for the pre-applied treatments, C crop 16 showed some promising results. It had increased chlorophyll concentration, photosynthetic rate, and decreased winter kill. And then in the crop applied treatments, the POMA plus nanocellulose showed promising preliminary results as well, with the increased chlorophyll concentration, photosynthetic rate, and the increased number of green fruit. So overall, major macronutrients really should be applied to the soil for the roots to uptake and not as a foliar product. But foliar nutrients do probably have a place in micronutrient applications. So based on the leaf analysis that Rafa performed on this, the foliar fertilizers would definitely benefit from an adjuvant or sticker such as the nanocellulose to really help the micronutrients get through that waxy cuticle. And then for next steps, we will be starting a new fertility trial at Blueberry Hill Farm this year. And we're deciding on which products based on this trial and also what's new in the market. So we can go to the next one, Lily.
The only thing I would add about the foliar is that the sales reps will really try to sell you a whole suite of different products, and you got to be really careful because we don't know what they all do together or which one is actually helpful to your crop. So that's why we looked at individual products at a time, whereas the companies will try to sell you, 4 or 5 of them to apply throughout the season. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you. So we also have an organic amendments trial, and this is taking place at 3 locations around the state: Appleton, Surrey, and Columbia Falls. This trial is running from 2019 to 2022, so we're about halfway through. And organic amendments in cropping systems have been known to increase crop resiliency through improving soil moisture retention and water holding capacity, as well as nutrient availability. So this is important as irrigation isn't always an option for growers, and the low pH of systems can restrict nutrient uptake for the crop. These may have good potential. So products listed are C crop, which we tested again here on both a prune and crop cycle. And then we have Cheap Cheap. This is an organic chicken manure. It contains NPK plus micronutrients and organic matter. And we applied Cheap Cheap at a fairly high rate here. You can see 1,000 pounds and 2,000 pounds per acre. And that was to obtain a target nitrogen of 40 pounds and 80 pounds per acre. So here we also have Coast of Maine Cobscook Garden Blend. And this is a garden soil composed of salmon, blueberry, compost, peat moss, and aged bark. It's a bit more expensive. And we also tested dark brown mulch and UMaine compost that was donated by the university. So these products were applied at rates recommended by the manufacturer, so rates that a grower or stakeholder would likely use. However, because the rates were not standardized to have the same organic matter or the same nitrogen, these treatments aren't scientifically comparable. We can go to the next one, Lily. So here's a picture of some of the treatments. On the far left, we have the dark brown mulch. In the center is the cheap, and I will note with this, you can see it has the nice light green new growth that you don't really see around it. And you can actually see it repeated in the back of the photo in the replicated block design. But there was also quite a bit of grass that you can see here. And then on the far right, we have the Coast of Maine Cobscope blend. I'm going to the next one. So on the next slide, we'll be looking at blueberry cover. And this was measured over 2019 and 2020 across all 3 locations. So it's pretty robust data with the range that it covered. So along the x-axis, we have the treatments, and you can see their high and low rates, with the exception of C crop, which just had different crop years. And significant differences were in extreme here, but you can see that adding something seemed to be better than nothing, as blueberry cover is higher than the control for almost all treatments. I'm going to go to the next one, Lily. And so we're going to be looking at harvest yield and weed pressure for the organic amendment trial. So weed pressure is in the green, and that's number per meter squared again, and yield is in the blue. So for weeds, you can see that cheap had significantly higher weeds, especially at the high rate. And then yield was not significantly different among treatments. However, you can see it's slightly higher for most all treatments, similar to the blueberry cover that we were just looking at. So here you can see this little star above the high rate of cheap. We actually had a significant correlation between the number of weeds per meter squared and the yield, suggesting that the weed pressure decreased the yield potential for this treatment, which is an effect that we would expect. So other measurements, we did look at insect pressure and disease pressure. These were pretty variable. There was no real trend here. Insect pressure was greater with cheap, but also chlorophyll concentration and macronutrients were higher with cheap. We can go to the next one. And so for the summarizing the organic amendments trial, the lower rate of chicken manure definitely seemed to have a better effect. There was less grass and a positive effect on chlorophyll concentration, blueberry cover, and yield. So it's rumored that in Quebec, they actually applied 200 pounds per acre, which is quite a bit less than what we used in this trial. But that might be the happy median in terms of getting a positive effect, but also avoiding the cost of the product to the degree that was shown in the initial table. But then you need to be careful with weed contamination with any material, such as with chicken manure. There could be higher seed in the bedding that might get mixed in. So overall, this trial still has 2 more years. It'll be interesting to see what another harvest will look like out of this, and that'll definitely make the data a lot more robust. So results will be coming on this. I think that's all I have, Lily.
Thanks, Brogan. And the next slide is one for Nicolas to just briefly talk about the SARE grant he did on nutrient management. I don't know if you can see the slide yet, but yeah. Nicolas, if you want to start talking, go for it.
Sure, yeah. So very quickly, I know our time is tight, but we had 4 different replications, one primarily using fish meal, but also aragonite, which is an organic source of calcium. And we applied those in 2 different rates, a high rate and a low rate, but also put it under ramiel chips, which is a hardwood, small diameter wood chip mulch. And then we had a control, and then we had a mulch only with no fish meal and no aragonite. And this past summer was the 3rd harvest, or actually, I guess it was 2 summers ago. We've had 3 harvests. And really, initially, it seemed like the higher rate of the fertilizer under the chip mulch had a boost to the yield, but then by the third harvest that had leveled out. And really what our data showed was that the stronger clones in the field, no matter what the treatment was, were outperforming, any of the other treatments in lower producing clones. That there's just so much genetic diversity, which also, may be in the soil, but I think it's more attributable to variables that we can't control. That's basically my conclusion of my study at this point, especially given the economic costs of applying the fertilizer and the mulch. It wasn't worth it in terms of yield benefits, but there are also all kinds of other benefits, including the effects of mulch that Becky talked about, both moisture and soil temperature regulation, health of plants and stuff like that, which you may not see in a yield, but in our fields, where we use the mulch, the plants are still very healthy. Weed control is really good. So that's kind of the snapshot quick of what my study showed.
Awesome. Thanks, Nicolas. So I think if anybody has questions about all these different nutrient management topics we just threw at you, kind of a summary of the work that's been done for organic fertility. If you could put your questions in the chat, that'd be great. We'll try to get to them at the end or by writing back to you. And I'm going to skip ahead to Lauren. I was going to cover some pest disease topics that you have already. We do have talks on those topics, so I'm going to switch to Lauren. Are you ready?
Yeah. Hi. So my name's Lauren and I have Lost and Found Farm. I grow cut flowers, but also low bush blueberries. And I process them all, everything that I harvest, and sell them as fresh pack. And I guess this is like an unaffiliated plug for Maine Farmland Trust and also Farm Smart, because this is my 4th season coming up, and something that I found really helpful was taking a course offered through Maine Farmland Trust called The Business of Farming, which provided a stipend for me to have some technical assistance that I used to work with Jed, who has the business Farm Smart, which is both of those organizations are up on the screen. And pretty much I'm just gonna share my screen and I'll just show you quickly a little bit about what I worked with Jed on, because I found it really helpful for what I'm doing and with Fresh Pack, and the berries being organic are really, people are looking for them to be organic as Fresh Pack in the markets that I'm selling at. So this was helpful for me to identify like my costs and if I'm charging enough and how much yield I'm getting per acre, what my labor looks like. And basically all of these spreadsheets I was able to work on with Jed, which allowed me to look at like berries that I'm selling that I'm winnowing for pints and quarts versus ones that I'm using for jam. And it incorporates all my fixed costs for the operation too. So it's helpful for me because all of these numbers, like everything in gray, I can change. So depending on the year, and what the variable costs for that field were, I can change and look at what my cost of production is. And from there, it allowed me to look at if that yield per acre were to shift. So the part on my screen now is just showing based on the harvest, if that harvest increases what my unit cost per pound is going to be. So that's just a helpful tool that I would recommend to folks if anyone's looking to work on some enterprise budgeting and cost of production. analysis.
As they should be. Thanks, Lauren. So creating a budget is so important to your success. Does anyone have questions for Lauren? Has everyone created a budget? I take that as a no. So maybe you should reach out to one of these folks.
I would just, I'd plug not only Jed Beach and the Maine Farmland Trust farmer programs, but also just a self plug. I am now a marketing and business specialist for MOFGA. So any serious organic grower can contact me, and as my professional position at MOFGA, I can help you. And I'm becoming familiar with Farm Calc, what
Oh, I forgot to mention that.
Lauren just showed. And
Okay.
I didn't mention Farm Calc though, Nicolas. I forgot that, because Farm Calc is something that's developed by Jed and is accessed through Maine Farmland Trust on their site. So anyone without like a consultation with Jed, folks can access Farm Calc. Is that right, Nicolas?
yeah, you can access Farm Calc through Maine Farmland Trust, though just going into it on your own would be a little difficult, but that's where I could help, you know, as my position at MOFGA as an ag service provider, I could help set it up for someone too.
Okay, so thank you all. It was really good to have the farmers chime in and share their experiences. I think that was really helpful and really good to hear from those farmers. So if you have questions for them, I'm sure they're happy to talk to you also. And I am also, if you have questions for us. And yeah, everybody have a good night. I'll stay on for a few minutes if people think of something to ask.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you, everybody. Great session.
It was, really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Very informative.
Thanks for sharing that, Lauren. That was awesome to see. I'm glad you're working out in Farm Calc with Jed with that stuff.
Yeah, that's quite a spreadsheet. That's great to see.
It does take a lot to kind of set it up, and there are a lot of numbers that you got to come up with, but once you have them, and it's so darn useful in so many different ways. Yeah. I'm
Yeah,
really,
it's in,
I'm getting pretty nerdy with numbers.
I bet, Nicolas, you're diving right into that.
All right. Thanks, Lily. That was great.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That was great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thanks, Cary. Very helpful.